Hey guys, welcome to the best podcast in the universe, The Melting Pot.
Yeah, without a doubt. It's your favorite podcast hosts, Matthew and Ashlyn.
So moving on to the main discussion of today, the Boston Massacre.
The Boston Massacre is interesting because it's considered by many historians to be the first battle of the Revolutionary War.
Awesome, so let's jump right in. Alright, what exactly is the Boston Massacre? Well, on March 5th, 1770, a street fight broke out in Boston, Massachusetts.
Actually, this deadly riot first began as a street brawl between American colonists and a single British soldier. However, it quickly turned into a chaotic and violent slaughter of many innocent citizens.
Prior to this drastic turn in the massacre, a small argument between British Private Hugh White and a few colonists outside the Custom House in Boston on King Street occurred.
Although the conflict started out as a small dispute, it escalated quickly as more colonists gathered. It turned out to be a more heated situation as these patriots started throwing snowballs, sticks, and stones with intent to hurt both Private Hugh White and the rest of the British squad.
Finally, when more British soldiers began to arrive, armed might I add, the colonists grew more frustrated and enraged. When one object hit Private Montgomery, he fired into the undispersed crowd, engaging other soldiers to fire into the crowd as well. 3 died on the scene and 2 died later on from wounds.
You know, it's interesting that this event could escalate so quickly. I think this brings up 2 important questions. First, what were the major causes that led to the massacre? And why did the major causes fuel the conflict between the 2 sides?
Those are some great questions. I think that there are 2 central factors that led to the Boston Massacre. The most apparent reason was the growing mistrust among the British soldiers and many Americans. In addition to the Boston Massacre, there had previously been incidents in which British soldiers clashed with Americans. The conflict even led to the beatings of British soldiers by Americans and British soldiers assaulting unarmed citizens. Secondly, there was a removal of 2 out of the 4 regiments. The result was an inadequate number of soldiers to keep the peace. However, there were still enough soldiers for the British to establish themselves as a greater military.
Wow, that's fascinating. So what you're saying is the British and the Americans already had a significant deal of conflict?
Yes, both parties had trouble putting aside their differences.
I think another factor that impacted the start of the Boston Massacre would be the revolt of the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were a series of measures passed by the British Parliament in 1767 that allowed a taxation of goods that were imported to America. The act may have significantly added more conflict between the 2 sides.
You know, I've always wondered who the major people that were involved with the treacherous situation were. Do you have any idea who's involved, Matthew?
Well, Ashlyn, if you listened to me earlier, the original brawl mostly consisted of people of American colonists, whose specific names are unknown, and the 1 British soldier, Private Hugh White.
Alright, Mr. Sassy. However, now that you mentioned it, I do remember a couple of people involved. As more British soldiers began to arrive at the scene, more chaos was sprouted. I recall reading that a local British officer of the watch named Captain Thomas Preston tried to get the crowd dispersed.
Yeah, all these people played key roles in the unfolding of the massacre. Another person that was in the massacre events, who we mentioned earlier, was Private Montgomery. He was arguably one of the most important people in the Boston Massacre because he was the first soldier to openly fire into the crowd, provoking the other soldiers to then also fire into the crowd.
I totally agree. It's like a chain effect. An American colonist threw an object at the soldiers, it hit Private Montgomery, and in turn knocked him down. This then led to, which we've learned, the first shot. Also, the 5 people who died were crucial because of their impacts the deaths had. The 3 that died almost instantly were Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, and James Cadwell. There were also 8 people wounded, 2 of whom died, Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned the impacts of the deaths. I wanted to actually discuss the impacts that the Boston Massacre had overall.
Of course, although I think that we should cover what happened directly after the Boston Massacre first. There was a town meeting that demanded the removal of the British and the trial of Captain Preston and his men for murder. The colonists were enraged by what had gone down. I think that also goes back to what we were just talking about regarding how the deaths specifically impact the colonists overall. The deaths led the American colonists to become angry and seek revenge and justice for what had been done.
Exactly. Also, to add on, at the trial, John Adams and Josiah Quincy II defended the British, which later led to their release. However, the 2 British soldiers, they were tried and found guilty of manslaughter.
I'm just glad that there was a bit of justice for the killed colonists. Even though the colonists did provoke a bit of violence by throwing objects, I definitely don't believe anybody deserved to die over the situation, even if England and the New World didn't get along.
I concur. The major impact of the Boston Massacre, however, is definitely that it was a signal event leading to the Revolutionary War. It caused the royal governor to evacuate the occupying army from the town of Boston, which brought the revolution to the armed rebellion throughout the colonies.
I honestly love learning about events like this. It just fascinates me so much that there are so many different perspectives and impacts for each situation.
The Boston Massacre has to be the most interesting simply because of how quickly things were able to escalate into a tragic event, and hopefully students continue to learn about it each year. It's so important to be informed on these types of things, just to be sure you, yourself, are an informed and good citizen.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into our thrilling podcast, The Melting Pot.
I know what you're thinking. Don't go. I love your podcast so much. Well, do not fret, listeners. We will be back with episode 2 in just a few short weeks with another exhilarating educational story for you. See you soon.